18th century was a turning point of human history. There are other hinge moments of history, but the invention of the steam engine by James Watt in Glasgow in the 1770s changed the world fundamentally. It was the decisive breakthrough out of what the economic historian Wrigley and others have called the organic economy to the modern industrial economy. Up until the steam engine, our societies were inherently limited in the energy that could be mobilized to basically animal power and human power, and a little bit of wind for sail, or wind and water for windmills and water mills. But that was a decisive limiting factor to production of food, to the overall scale of economic activity. Then came the harnessing of fossil fuels with the Newcomen steam engine first at the first years of the 18th century, and then James Watt steam engine in the 1770s. And we've never looked back, basically. That allowed for such a dramatic mobilization of primary energy for the purposes of work and economic activity that it essentially enabled the modern global economy. Of course, it wasn't the only decisive invention, but it was the one that triggered the period of endogenous economic growth since that time, where expanding markets led to new innovations, led to further expansion of markets, led to new innovations in ongoing geometric growth that has now lasted for more than 2 centuries. Of course, this period is marked by upheavals, by very different paces of performance in different regions in different times, all that constitute the subject of economic development, to try to explain those variations across space and across time. And it's a fascinating subject, I can say, having practiced it for the last 40 years. There's a lot to say and a lot to think about. But for purposes right now, I just want to focus on the unleashing of modern economic growth. Among many consequences of the industrial age based on fossil fuels was the vast increase of the capacity to grow food. And that itself came from many reasons: the ability to ship food, the ability to open up agricultural hinterlands, and in the 19th century, the ability to mobilize forms of fertilizer like guano deposits off the coasts of Latin America that greatly improved crop productivity, nitrogen content in European agriculture. And in the 20th century, with the Haber-Bosch process for fixing nitrogen, active nitrogen, enabling synthetic nitrogen-based fertilizers. And all of that meant a phenomenal expansion in the capacity to grow food and to support a growing human population. We all should always recall what Malthus said in 1798 in the Principles of Population, that basically humanity was doomed to subsistence because any technological advance would be frittered away by a commensurate expansion of the population until living standards were driven back down to subsistence. But in the event, the capacities of technological change did lead to massive increases of population, but the technological pace outpaced the population growth, and something that Malthus didn't envision. After a certain level of education and incomes were reached, and developments of contraceptive technologies, richer households and then richer societies voluntarily reduced fertility rates to subsistence levels so that technological change showed up increasingly in per capita income growth rather than simply population growth. Suffice it to say, since Watt's steam engine, in very rough terms, global output has increased, say, 100 times, and per capita output roughly 10 times, and per capita and population roughly 10 times. So where there were around 800 million people in the late 18th century, now we have 8 billion people, and per capita output on average worldwide, it's not quite meaningful to say, but it's roughly meaningful to say, has increased about 10 times. Of course, it's a different world, so our index numbers are not really so good at comparing life in 1780 and life in 2020. But suffice it to say, huge increases of both living standards and populations. Okay, that brings us to our recent world. There's a lot of history that would take us many courses to discuss, but the first phase of industrialization from around 1770 to 1950 was largely accomplished in Europe, in the United States, and to an extent in Japan. So there was a very concentrated part of the world that industrialized. Most of the rest of the world was colonized or subjected to imperial power by virtue of this vastly increased military capacity of the industrial nations, which took over a lot of the rest of the world, either de jure or de facto. From 1950 till today, most of the former colonies became independent, and broadly speaking, countries that had lagged far behind the industrial process began to catch up and narrow the gaps. And the most decisive illustrations of that have been the countries of East Asia, Japan, Korea, South Korea, China, and parts of the ASEAN region as well, that have experienced rapid economic growth since the 1950s and become high-income countries, or what we call upper middle-income countries. Okay, the result of all of this 250 years is a highly unequal world, but now with the three major centers of advanced economies, North America, Europe, and East Asia, and other parts of the world, either so-called middle income or low income parts of the world. And again, a lot of development economics is really designed to explain why we have this divergence. And I think it's a matter of history, politics, military story, physical geography, and other types of explanations. No single factor, but multiple interacting factors that I trace to an extent in a recent book called The Ages of Globalization that I published this year. Now, we face a very unequal world, but we also face another fundamental challenge. And that fundamental challenge is that with an expansion of world output 100-fold, the pressures on the physical earth from all this economic activity have also, at this point, reached really a boil, reached a massive set of interconnected environmental crises. And this has only been realized gradually during this period, because starting with the Industrial Revolution, especially under the influence of Protestant ideology, the idea was that humanity should conquer nature and conquer the world. and there wasn't really an understanding of sustainability or stewardship of the planet or dangers to the planet from human activity. Bible reading Protestants in the UK, the US, and elsewhere assumed that God had created Earth for human domination, and it was pretty much as straightforward as that. Take the resources that one can, and it was thought that the resources are basically infinite to a practical extent, and not vulnerable to degradation or depletion. And there are a lot of people in my country, in the United States, that still believe that idea, especially biblical fundamentalists, because that's what they read in a book that was written 2,000 years ago. And unfortunately, they don't read a lot of modern things. They believe in the literal word of the Bible. There are still a lot of Americans like that, and they get a very strange view of reality as a result of that, a very unreal view of reality. Well, it was discovered already about 100 years after the Watt steam engine that when you burn fossil fuel and release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, that changes the planet's climate. This began to be understood around the 1870s when it was discovered that carbon dioxide is a so-called greenhouse gas. That took a lot of the 19th century to understand. And by 1896, a brilliant chemist, Svante Arrhenius, the Swedish Nobel laureate chemist, understood that human burning of coal would change the climate. And he actually made a paper and pencil calculation that by doubling the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, humans would increase the Earth's temperature, he calculated, by about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. And now we think that the climate sensitivity to a carbon doubling is about 3 degrees Celsius. So Arrhenius was not far off in paper and pencil calculations made 124 years ago. A real genius. It's not just fossil fuel. It's not just climate change, of course. Humans took over more and more ecosystem functioning in order to direct food production towards human use, either a direct consumption of plant materials or indirect consumption of feeding grains to animals, and then a massive increase of meat consumption, which has a great multiplier effect on the planet, given that it takes 15 kilograms of feed grain, more or less, to produce 1 kilogram of beef for final consumption, given the trophic difference of growing a staple grain versus raising a cow or cattle. And so huge requisition of global ecosystems for human consumption. That's true on land, with massive deforestation and land clearing for pastures and for farmland. And it's true in the oceans, with the massive harvesting of fish and other marine life for marine-based proteins. And in both cases, the result is an incredible depletion of species and an incredible destruction of terrestrial and marine ecosystems. So this has gone on now for 2 centuries plus, and a 100-fold increase of human activity, and we're wrecking the planet. And it's been now more or less 50 years that we've realized this progressively, but the juggernaut of economic growth is so powerful that we've not gotten this juggernaut of global economic growth under control. This is for many reasons. One is that each individual country, for its national security, its pride, its public demands, wants the good life, irrespective of the global external consequences of that increased activity. So a lot of the economic damage is an international spillover or externality. Partly, even when it's a domestic externality, those who make money off of the polluting activity are politically more powerful than those who lose from the damage, even though the social losses could be much larger than the economic gains. And partly it's an intergenerational externality in that the current generations, with the ethical and practical short-sightedness, are causing great damage for future generations. So there are many, many reasons why the damages that are being caused are not caught in our economic system, and our ethics as individuals and as societies and globally are too weak right now to even realize the vast damages that are being caused. We've been facing this collision of ecology and economy for about 50 years now, because it was in 1972 that the first conference on the human environment took place in Stockholm. It's been almost 30 years since the second main conference in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 adopted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention to Combat Desertification in Drylands. And all of these principles have become more understood, but the juggernaut basically continues. And the result is 4 massive environmental crises, all interconnected: climate change, collapse of biodiversity, massive chemical pollutants, and increasing frequency of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 or SARS or MERS or Nipah virus or H1N1. In other words, destabilizing natural ecosystems transfers pathogens or recombines pathogens in ways that pose profound threats to humans and other species. So we've got a colossal environmental crisis at hand. And we have a massive crisis of inequality as well. Economic growth is continuing at a good clip, even taking into account this year's COVID-19 disaster. And the rate of technological change is certainly not slowing. The digital revolution is probably accelerating overall economic change and continuing these forces of growing inequality and environmental destruction. And so I think there's nothing in the economic system which really protects us from the downsides of this technological machine, which operates at a global scale. And as countries distrust each other, they battle for economic progress, partly because it's directly linked to military capacity and to what they perceive as national security, irrespective of other damage that's being done. And we have an ideology that really has been led by the United States, a neoliberal ideology, which says that what the markets say anyway is what we should do, because the markets are a reflection of freedom. And if that freedom leads to mass inequality or to massive environmental destruction, according to this philosophy, so be it. And since the United States has been so powerful in the world for the last 70 years, that neoliberal philosophy has permeated our textbooks, our courses, our thinking, our understanding of economics, our implicit ethics, our explicit ethics, our global negotiations, and so on. And so this has been a continuing crisis. The digital revolution that we're now living through, accelerated by COVID, probably is greatly worsening the inequalities. My guess is that 2020 is the biggest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in a single year in peacetime history, maybe ever, because the digital world has boomed this year, whereas the physical economy has collapsed in many places. So we're seeing not just an economic collapse from COVID, we're seeing a boom also from COVID in digital economies. So today, I happened to look it up this morning. 5 companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Alibaba, together have a combined market cap of $5.9 trillion. 5 companies. This is, the idea of $1 trillion company in the past was mind-boggling. Now this is becoming kind of routine. But these digital companies have had a boom of wealth. Their owners have had wealth increases this year that we can hardly imagine for Americans. Bezos, Gates, Zuckerberg, and Musk now have a net worth of $540 billion for people. And their wealth has gone up 100 billion plus. I don't remember the number exactly. I can find it. Their wealth has gone up by $200 billion this year alone, just 4 people. So this is a very weird world where the wealth overall is soaring and rising to the very top. The inequalities are rising right now. The environmental destruction is soaring. And the question is, can we get a grip on this? And what is the role of economists in all of this challenge? So my view is that the framework that we need is a different framework that starts with sustainable development as the basic organizing principle. Sustainable development means that we, by objective, want societies that are socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. Socially inclusive means that everybody can meet their basic economic needs. Environmentally sustainable means that the climate and other Earth systems are operating on a sustainable trajectory without the collapse of biodiversity, without mega pollution, and without human-induced climate change, or more precisely, with human-induced climate change stabilized by mid-century at less than 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, and then with temperatures tending to reduce gradually back to towards pre-industrial levels in the second half of the 21st century. So I regard that as our practical direction that we have to take. I think the job of economics is to help assess how to achieve this, what kinds of mechanisms of public investment, redistribution, regulatory framework, and so forth can most effectively create fair and sustainable societies. And how can we forge market combined with non-market institutions that can actually bring about the kind of transformation that we should want. I'll just end by saying a word about what we should want. What we should want is human well-being. And economics should start by asking the question, what is good for human beings? And that is not a utility function. That's a silly idea. what is good for human beings goes much more deeply than U of C. And we should ask seriously the question of what is good for human beings. That's what ethics is addressed to. And what ethics has taught us over 2,000 years, both in Asian ethics such as Confucianism and Western ethics such as Aristotelianism or Christian thought, is that we want for good lives to be able to meet basic needs, but then also to live with moderation and to live with sociality and to live with social justice. And those are quite different from maximizing utility. So we really need to rethink, in my view, our economic principles. We got stuck on utility theory, which is a very naive idea about human well-being, because maybe seeking wealth or maximizing preferences, so-called, made sense when one was talking about escaping from poverty. But it makes little sense in a world that is already wealthy, but is destroying itself. And our goals for a good life on the planet now can be more sophisticated than maximizing consumption goods. So we should think about what humans really want and need for healthy and decent lives, and rebase economics on a new kind of ethical foundation. I'm writing about that myself now. It's quite interesting to go back to Aristotelian thought or Confucian thought or to other ethical precepts and rethink economic principles in that regard, because it leads to very different kinds of conclusions from what we have been led to in the pursuit of wealth as the centerpiece of our economics. And I think we've reached the point where if we just blindly pursue wealth, we will end up destroying most of what we really value. So let me stop there. Very brief, but it should help us get started in discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Sachs. That was a really neat summary of the last 300 years, and especially the bit about utility function. I really appreciate the discussion. So while as the questions are flooding in, I would like to start off with a question of mine. And I really enjoyed reading your book, The End of Poverty, and that kind of triggered my interest for developmental economics. So how do you think that the field of developmental economics have changed in the last 10 years, especially with the introduction of the SDGs in 2015, as well as COVID, and whether the economic tools that we have and are being taught to economic students like us, do you think they are sufficient moving us forward?
I think in the practice of development, we can learn a lot, starting with China. China was a country where poverty rates were, depending on how you measure it, 60 to 80% of the population poor in 1970. And now this year, basically no person in extreme poverty in China, or almost none. So this is a demonstration that development or end of poverty is utterly feasible. And China created a fantastic system for overcoming extreme poverty by massive investments in education, in health, and in physical infrastructure, and then in integrating China into the world economy, so that China became basically the manufacturing center of the world economy, and now increasingly into higher technology, especially digital economy, where China is becoming a major leader in artificial intelligence, 5G, and other systems. So I would start by saying that we've learned, not only China, but China and the neighbors have succeeded in ending poverty, and we should study those lessons. How that happened in such a short period of time, what kind of mix of public and private institutions best facilitated that. And I think what we see is a range of investments in human capital, infrastructure capital, business capital, and a range of private and public organizational forms that combined in a very sophisticated way to bring about this progress. Not everything is perfect about this, because China became a lot more polluted and suffered a lot of environmental harms, and China became the #1 greenhouse emitting country of the world during this process. So that kind of dirty development now needs to be transformed into clean technologies. And this becomes the challenge, I would say, of the next 20 to 30 years in China. But the first point is development is possible at a very rapid rate. And it's mainly through skills and technology and infrastructure. Second, we see that the digital technologies are probably the main drivers right now of economic change and the main possibilities for leapfrogging in certain areas of the economy. But there are also troubles with the digital economy as well. On the positive side, the digital world enables big breakthroughs in electronic payments, where we've seen countries that had no banks essentially go to almost universal online banking. We have seen big advances in telemedicine, of course, distance education, like we're living in this year, in e-governance, in governments, for example, making direct transfers to households through electronic accounts, or regularizing taxation in this way. So I would say that the digital technologies are a huge area for advancement in development and in ending poverty. The downside is that a lot of traditional development was labor-intensive manufacturing. So when China got started, or Japan before China, the work started in textiles, apparel, electronics assembly, shoe manufacturing, and so forth. Most of those jobs are now mechanized. And so countries that are still poor today can't really follow the same path of labor-intensive manufacturing. They need different paths of income generation and exports. In Africa, I would like young Africans trained in the digital economy to be working not in labor-intensive manufacturers, but in the digital global economy, perhaps working in selling digital services internationally as a new kind of export. Of course, we have back office operations done digitally, call centers, and so on, but there's a huge scope for globalizing the digital economy and creating a lot of jobs in the developing world as a result of this. So I think the whole question of digital and development is a second big issue. A third big issue is, for me, it's always been the question of how we create a global financial structure and political structure to enable places that are desperately behind in development to make breakthroughs. This was the point of the end of poverty, that helping the very poorest places get on the ladder of development is a massive challenge. And everything that I've seen since I wrote that book in 2005 confirms for me the usefulness of international resource transfers of one form or another, to facilitate the takeoff of economic growth, especially in very hard-hit regions. So we still need global governance in some ways to help bring this kind of change about. But these, I would say, are some of the lessons. You can have rapid development. Now it has to be green rapid development. Now it has to be digital rapid development. And it has to take place still in a global context.
Yeah, thank you so much. You mentioned a point about political will. So there's two really beautiful questions by the audience. So I'm very interested in to understand, how do you think international development agencies need to change in current times? And also, how do you provide political will to political leaders within developing and developed countries to motivate them?
In terms of international institutions, say the IMF or the World Bank or others, the starting point, of course, is to understand that those are governed by their member states, and principally by a few major states. They were created, in the case of the IMF and the World Bank, at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, and they were created as US-led institutions. The US after World War II was completely dominant politically, financially, technologically, militarily, and it created the post-war order to a large extent. In Washington, D.C., the White House is on 16th and Pennsylvania Avenue, and the World Bank is at 18th and Pennsylvania Avenue, and the IMF is at 19th and Pennsylvania Avenue. So, and the Treasury is at 15th and Pennsylvania Avenue, and the Executive Office of the President is at 17th and Pennsylvania Avenue. So if you think about that stretch of 5 blocks, Treasury, White House, presidential offices, World Bank, IMF, it could not be more vivid, the power system of 1945. But the world has changed a lot now. The US is not so powerful. China is a lot more powerful. Other countries are relatively more powerful, and we're in a very difficult period of geopolitical shift. This is a lot of our problem right now. It's driving the US crazy, you can see. You know, the US doesn't know what to do about China's power, success, economic growth. My view is we should applaud it. It's a great thing for the world. Great for China, great for the world as far as I'm concerned. But for the US, for some US nationalists, it's horrible. How dare China become so powerful? This is supposed to be a US-led world. So there's a lot of geopolitical tension. Well, Trump was the stupidest and the worst president we ever had, as far as I'm concerned. But he was also an extreme nationalist. And so for him, any gain of China was a loss for the United States. That's a simple-minded nationalism. This created crisis because the US under Trump tried to stop China's advance, and it basically paralyzed a lot of these international institutions also, which can only function if the major countries within them are cooperating and helping them to fulfill their mandates. They don't really design their own actions at a fundamental level, though there's some, of course, technical design. They're very heavily influenced by geopolitics. And this, I think, is a major point. Of course, I'm interested in the geopolitics of cooperation because I see all the gains of cooperation, and I would like us to take the ethical point of view of what Adam Smith called the impartial spectator. That is not the point of view of any individual country, but the point of view of an independent observer who says, how should the world system work? Not how should any individual country work. So I don't really like the nationalism at all. I think it's detrimental, naive, close-minded, self-destructive. It's the prisoner's dilemma where you don't cooperate. What we need is the prisoner's dilemma where you do cooperate, and the countries work together for the mutual gain. So this is on the international institutions. We need them. They're critical. The IMF has played a huge positive role in the COVID-19 pandemic. It's basically lent about $100 billion of emergency financing to 80 developing countries. But I would say it's not close to enough. And the limits on the IMF have come from the United States this year, because the IMF technical staff said that there should be a new allocation of special drawing rights, which is essentially new money, in a way, high-powered money, because the SDR is an envelope of a few major convertible currencies, including the renminbi, the dollar, and the euro. There should be a new allocation of SDRs to give liquidity to the poorest countries, but the United States has vetoed that so far. So this is where technical considerations in geopolitics tend to conflict with each other. I'm hoping that under President Biden, we'll have more global cooperation. And I think that if the US, Europe, China, Japan, Korea could cooperate with each other, we could solve a lot of the current crises. In fact, it's interesting, last weekend, 15 countries signed an important trade agreement in what's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. This is an agreement that brings together China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the 10 ASEAN countries. I really like that group of countries because it's geopolitically very interesting, culturally diverse, but all with a shared Asia-Pacific set of interests, and a lot of trade amongst themselves. And when you think about it, it's 2.2 billion people in RCEP. It's a $25 trillion GDP, roughly, about 25% of the world economy. And interestingly, almost every country in RCEP has succeeded in suppressing COVID-19. And so it's a region that has done quite well in controlling the pandemic, as opposed to Europe and the United States. And so maybe RCEP could become a new organizing principle for the Asia Pacific. And then we'd have RCEP, European Union, North America, as three major growth centers cooperating with each other in a sensible way. Of course, I don't want to leave out other parts of the world, the African Union, Latin America, and so forth. But I think this kind of regional cooperation can play a very big role.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, thank you so much for the overview on how international development agencies have been relatively stuck in historical reasons and political reasons. So now we have a question more towards the field of economics. So Nick and Keith ask, why has economics been stuck in its form today, and what are some of the questions that economics students can do to contribute to this field and to make the world better?
I think it's really a good question. I think our field has some very interesting strengths, but a lot of weaknesses also. The strengths are a concept of general systems equilibrium, I think is extremely important. We have a natural training and capacity to view the material life of a society in a systems way. What is the resource base? What is the technology? And what are modes of interaction? within that. And we have a concept of equilibrium. And all of this is, I think, very helpful. But it's also a very weak field in a number of other ways. First, it's our training is mostly conceptual rather than empirical. And so students are not given much of an education in how economies actually function, what their institutions are, what the empirical realities are. It would be as if a medical student, instead of learning the organ systems and the parts of the body, were assume a body. It has N bones, M kinds of proteins, J kinds of nutrients, just never looking at a human body, just trying to make a generalization. It would be a very silly way to teach medical science, because in the end, you're trying to work with real human beings on their real problems. But our training does not work that way. The way we train, after you're trained, then you have to spend a long time working on real problems to actually get the quantitative and empirical sense of how things work. One of the huge shortcomings is that for us, the market is the organizing principle. But in the real world, that's not true at all. The market is one kind of exchange institution, but there are multiple others, starting with the government, which in a normal European country collects more than 40% of national income in taxes and distributes more than 40% of national income. That's not a small side effect. That is central. And the rest of the economy, the so-called market part, also is divided between for-profit and not-for-profit or third-way sectors. And we don't study this kind of economics properly. Of course, the point was made by Karl Polanyi 75 years ago in The Great Transformation, that real economics is about multiple kinds of institutions, not mainly markets. But when we train in economics, markets are the center of everything. Everything else is a kind of exception. And the first thing we try to do is find a market solution. Stop. This is not right. Markets are helpful for certain things. They're not helpful for other things. Governments are really helpful for certain things. We have collective action for good public goods reasons, and not as minor exceptions, but as fundamental. That's one major problem. So one problem is empirical. The historical and the quantitative and the qualitative sense. Second is the excessive focus on markets as drivers of resource utilization and deployment, and that is not right. Third, given how crucial technologies are to how we live and organize activity, we should be spending a lot more time on not the theory of pure technological change, but on the reality of digital technologies for how that affects, for example, every sector of the economy right now. I mentioned them. There isn't a sector of our lives not deeply transformed by digitization now. Governance, finance, payments, medicine, health, services, commerce, mobility, you name it, manufacturing, agriculture, mining. So there are too few studies asking how will technological change of a real kind that we're experiencing transform lives. It's a central question. But maybe because we're waiting for 25 years more of data to run some regressions, we're not looking ahead adequately with the tools that we have to try to understand better what all of this will mean. And we should be trying to work together with engineers and I'd say engineers would be a good place to start. Engineers, public health specialists, which is kind of engineering, of population health, and economic concepts to try to bring these pieces together. Then I've already mentioned we don't have an adequate theory of the good. Economics should be inherently an ethical science, meaning ethics is the science of a good life. We're interested in economics because we think it can contribute to a good life. But what is a good life? Well, we say in the first day of class, agent I has a utility function, U superscript I of C, and that's the end of it. And then they maximize utility, and we have Pareto improvements, and we do all sorts of things. But that's not much of a theory of the good life of agent I. And if we took seriously what is a good life, we would have a different kind of economics, I think, because so much of our economics is, well, our economics should be organized around enabling humanity to achieve a good life. When people were poor, a good life meant more wealth. So it made perfect sense for Adam Smith in 1776 to write The Wealth of Nations. Now we need the well-being of nations, because we're after not just wealth, we're after well-being. Well-being is physical and mental well-being, is social well-being, is societies that function properly, is environmental well-being, is people living with a good balance of work and leisure, because leisure is really an important idea. Not if you're impoverished. In 1776, people weren't spending a lot of time thinking about leisure except for a tiny leisure class. But now people have time because machines can do a lot of our work. So what should we be doing with our lives? That's a good economics question, both a normative one and a very practical one in terms of organizing work activity. Should everybody have guaranteed vacation time? Should everybody have guaranteed leave time? How should the life cycle be organized in a world in which people don't really have to work so many hours if we deploy these technologies properly in order to achieve the basic economic goods? But I do find it as a prima facie challenge to economics that here we're as rich as can be, and we're destroying the planet, and we can't figure out that that's a paradox. And still, environmental economics is a kind of footnote, and climate change is, well, we should have a tax on carbon dioxide. And it's all done. The most momentous problems are treated as footnotes rather than as central concerns for an ethical profession. Indeed, extraordinary days. We had the opening of the UN General Assembly yesterday online, and heard from some of the world leaders. And I think it is fair to say the world situation is a mess right now. I want to speak just a few minutes about COVID, which of course is on the top of mind everywhere, or at least should be, because we're still in absolutely the midst of a terrible global pandemic, which has disrupted everything. But I also want to speak a bit about global politics and its implications for the future and for India. Well, this pandemic is not in control, that is for sure. And what I want to raise very briefly is something that I think people know, but really should focus on. And that is that the experience of this pandemic has been incredibly diverse across the world. And we're not learning adequately from the success stories. So I live in a country, the United States, where the pandemic continues to rage, where we have more than 200,000 deaths as of yesterday, crossing that official line, and where tens of thousands of people are being infected every day. In India, the situation is basically the same. There are each day around 90,000 new confirmed cases, and probably many times that if you take into account the cases that are not picked up by testing. There are more than 1,000 deaths per day. India now has more than 90,000 deaths and more than 5.6 million confirmed cases. And I would say, in general, the epidemic is not under control in India, and the case levels, though they fluctuate by the day or by the week, are rising, not falling. And India is in no way anywhere remotely close to this pandemic being over. And yet, at the same time as we have this outcome in India and in the United States, we have in the Asia-Pacific region, that is East Asia and the countries of Oceania and most of Southeast Asia, a very different situation. In China, almost no cases at all. So India, 90,000 per day. In China, a handful. Some days, none. In Taiwan, basically no cases at all. In Hong Kong, basically no cases at all. In Korea, a few cases per day. In Japan, a few cases per day. In New Zealand, almost no cases. So just next door to India, we see a completely different situation. And in the ASEAN countries, some remarkable experiences of low-income countries that essentially kept this virus out. Vietnam, very few cases. Laos and Cambodia, basically zero cases. In Southeast Asia, it's Indonesia and the Philippines where there have been many cases, but even there, the situation is at least partially in control in Indonesia and the Philippines. So what is the lesson from this? Most of all, the lesson is about governance. It is about the effectiveness and coherence and rigor of governments carrying out so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions against the virus. And I think everybody knows by now, because we hear the list daily, what are those non-pharmaceutical interventions? They are, of course, wearing face masks everywhere, physical distancing, meaning very, very few places with any crowding of people, keeping physical distancing in public areas and in retail areas and in public events. Very importantly, widespread testing and then tracing contacts of those who are infected to stamp down the onward transmission of the diseases. Yet, in my country, in the United States, this did not happen because the President of the United States, despite what one may hear in India, our president is completely incompetent and uncaring. Really an awful, terrible leader, I'm afraid, who has been totally unable and uninterested to put in place effective measures. He politicized wearing face masks. He made it seem like it was an infringement of freedom to have people wear face masks. He called constantly for reopening the economy immediately, he completely neglected the role of testing and tracing. He demeaned and denigrated the scientists in the US government. In my opinion, he's the worst president in American history, and we have more than 200,000 needless deaths as a result of this. In India, the situation is different. The government started by taking this seriously. Of course, in India, the context is also very difficult because of much more poverty and informality and the difficulties of management. And India has underinvested in its public health system basically since independence until today. And so the amount of public health management is much less, public health personnel much less, public health rigor much less. So in India, there was a harsh lockdown at the beginning, but it was not followed by systematic public health interventions that I would have regarded as equivalent to what we see in the Asia-Pacific region. By all reports, and this is from a distance, the amount of testing and tracing has been wholly inadequate. In fact, contact tracing largely was suspended in many parts of India during the summer. Now India is opening up and easing restrictions further in the interests of the economy, but without the control of the pandemic. I personally doubt that this can be successful, because the idea that one can have an economic recovery at the same time as having transmission of around 100,000 cases per day or more seems to me to be very unrealistic. And so the lessons that we have globally are that when the leadership is weak and when the public health system is not aggressive and effective, the epidemic remains under control, remains out of control, and the economic recovery does not occur, even if that is the priority of government. People are getting sick, people are not spending, businesses are not investing, supply chains are disrupted, and the result is that there is no economic recovery. The country that is going to recover fastest and most dramatically in the world will actually be China. China is having a significant economic rebound because it brought the virus decisively under control. And I think that this will be true throughout the Asia-Pacific region in those countries that have successfully controlled the pandemic. So I would urge from afar and with all respect that India not give up on the public health measures, but use this warning sign of massive cases and massive deaths per day as the occasion to redouble the efforts on the non-pharmaceutical interventions and to be far more systematic than India has been in recent months on case testing, contact tracing, physical distancing, keeping a prevention on large gatherings, religious or social or cultural or sports events that can become major spreaders of the disease. Unfortunately, this is very complicated in India, I know, and India is so diverse and with so many differences across the states in the capacity for management. that this will not come easily. But I do greatly fear, as I have from the beginning, that if this gets out of control in India, the consequences will be very, very dire. Even if it looks like the death rates are not that high, the explosion in the number of cases multiplied by the death rates that are observed would be a terrible outcome and a very dangerous one. Now, these differences across the world, especially China rebounding and the United States in deeper crisis and India in deeper crisis, are adding to geopolitical divisions and adding to geopolitical threats. One of the responses of Trump to his failures to control the pandemic has been to lash out at China. And by and large, Prime Minister Modi has sided with Trump and, of course, with the border skirmishes in the China-India border region. This has added to the tensions. And then Prime Minister Modi joined Trump in barring Chinese digital applications as well. So we went into the opening of the General Assembly yesterday with a growing geopolitical threat of the United States trying to create a Cold War with China and enlisting very openly India in that Cold War. And many people in India feeling that being tough on China is necessary as well. I regard this as very dangerous, and I want to warn you how dangerous it is. My hope is that Mr. Trump will be defeated in the November elections. As I say, I regard him as the greatest threat to the United States of any president that we have had in our history. And I regard him not as a friend of India because he is misleading and misguiding India in this response. If we go to this kind of increased tension, this will be extraordinarily dangerous for the world and extraordinarily unnecessary. Yet at the General Assembly yesterday, Trump lashed out at China. In my opinion, a very vulgar approach and a very vulgar place to do this at the UN General Assembly, to cast blame and to cast aspersions on another superpower in this way. But I believe that this idea of creating confrontation will only raise the dangers in the world, hinder economic recovery, lose the advantages of cooperation, and in the end, fail to accomplish anything that is constructive. For President Xi Jinping's response at the UN yesterday, what we saw instead was a rejection of the idea of a Cold War. China saying that it aims to cooperate with other countries in suppressing the pandemic, that it aims to work with the World Health Organization and the rest of the world to stop this pandemic, and that it aims to recover using green, clean technologies, which is something extraordinarily important for the other major global crisis that we face, which is environmental catastrophe, especially climate change, another area where India is enormously vulnerable, perhaps the most vulnerable country in the world to climate change. China said yesterday something very, very important that I also want to bring to the attention in India. President Xi announced that China would move to carbon neutrality by 2060. In other words, that China would phase out of fossil fuels between now and 2060. This was a major announcement that I think will bring China into closer cooperation with many parts of the world. And it was a major advance in China's policies on climate change. So I want to urge that India follow this course. Europe has announced that it will decarbonize by 2050. China announced yesterday that it will decarbonize by 2060. If Vice President Biden is elected, which I think is likely and extremely important, the United States will be on track to decarbonize by mid-century. India, which has huge stakes in this, should be following a similar course now of announcing a goal around mid-century for ending the dependence on fossil fuels, cleaning the air, and helping in India's part to ensure that the world transitions to safe, clean, green energy. And by doing so, India would build its own industrial capacities for the clean, green recovery ahead. So to summarize, I believe that the approach of confrontation is a dead end. I believe that unless every major country in the world gets this epidemic under control decisively through stepped up public health measures, our economies and our safety will continue to be at grave risk. I believe that India has great stakes in closer cooperation with the countries of East Asia, and especially with China, because of its importance in trade and in technology, and believe that India should not follow the misguided and ultra-nationalistic policies of Trump, which I hope will be gone after the November election in any event, but rather find a path to closer cooperation, peaceful borders, more trade, and cooperation in a green recovery, which is the only kind of safe recovery that we can have. The stakes are very, very high right now. I can't recall in my lifetime a period of such geopolitical uncertainty and such economic and financial uncertainty. India has a huge role to play in helping the world to find a path to peaceful and sustainable economic development and recovery. And so I really look for India's leadership, first to contain the pandemic within India, and then to reach out diplomatically to help overcome divisions rather than intensify them, and for all of us to build back better with a fairer economy, with more investments in health and education, with a strong reliance on the new digital technologies, and a shift to renewable energy with a clear target to reach a safe, global, decarbonized energy system by mid-century. Thank you very much for the chance to share a few thoughts with you today. I really appreciate it.